Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 68, God's victorious procession. We start with the superscription for the choir director, a Psalm of David, a song. We've heard those lines before, so there's nothing really new here. And now the psalm itself begins with the words, "Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered, and let those who hate him flee before him." Now, as we hear these words, we're supposed to say, "Wait a minute, I've heard this before." This opening line, these opening lines are actually echoed back in the Torah, back in the where Moses is at Mount Sinai, and he's been there throughout Exodus and Leviticus, and then finally Numbers. And in the book of Numbers, chapter 10, verse 35, we read it came about when the ark set out. They're setting out from Mount Sinai. They're getting ready to go to the promised land. They're not going to make it, but they don't know that yet. And Moses said, "Rise up, O Lord," same words, "rise up, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered, let those who hate you flee before you." Now, notice the enemy part, those who hate him. Yes, it's ad-libbed a little bit, and instead of God, it's Lord back in Numbers, the name of God. But remember, this is that portion of the Psalm, this is that book of the Psalms that's really not using the name of of God if they can sort of get around it. Not that it's bad, but they are trying to. I think this is the reason they're trying to treat the name of God holy, and so they're when possible, oftentimes they're substituting the term Elohim, God, instead of Lord. But that's not going to be a hard fast rule. Notice those who hate him, verse 2, as smoke is driven away, so drive them, that is, again, those who hate, drive them away. As wax melts before the fire, so let the wicked perish before God. So we said this is going to be his procession. They're getting ready to get up and go, but it's the victorious procession because to have a victory, you have to have a conflict. To have a conflict, you have to have an enemy, and there are enemies abroad. We continue into verse 3, but let the righteous be glad, let them exult. Notice, yes, the enemies are there, but the righteous are going to win. Let them exult before the Lord. Let them rejoice with gladness. Call now to sing to the Lord, sing praises to his name, lift up a song for him. Now, the word song isn't there, but the lifting up is lifting up something. Probably a song is the context. For him who rides through the deserts. Now, that term, for him who rides through the deserts, that would fit the whole Sinai thing. However, the King James Version renders it him that rideth upon the heavens. And that's an interesting. Now, the word there is deserts. You say, well, why did the King James do it that way? I think maybe they saw something that was there, even though the archaeology hadn't taken place yet. Maybe they looked over the Septuagint. I haven't checked the Septuagint. Um, but both the NIV and the New English Translation, and also Robert Alter, who I don't always agree with, but I always want to hear what he has to say. Hebraeus has his own translation of the Psalms. He renders this the rider of the clouds, and the NIV and the NET, New English Standard Version, follow that example. And what they're doing, they're drawing that from a similar Ugaritic expression. And so, lift up a song to the one writing, the writer of the clouds. I like that. I'm not sure which way to go, so I'm putting both here. And then notice whose name is the Lord. Now this time it's we've been used to seeing Yahweh, but sometimes in poetry especially we see the shortened form of that. Well, it does make it rhyme, but maybe it makes the rhythm work a little bit better. Um, so his name is Lord, and exalt before him. So that's the call. Notice you're going to exalt, sing, praise. This is a praising procession that we're seeing en route to wherever they're going. We're not there yet, so we'll see when they arrive. Verse 5, he is a father to the fatherless. This is speaking of God. We're going to see he's in his holy habitation. A father of the fatherless, a judge for the widows is God in his holy habitation. God makes a home for the lonely. He leads out, remember, this is a procession, in this case, a joyous procession. He leads out the prisoners into prosperity. Notice that God is the one who takes care of the downtrodden. whether it's the fatherless, that is the orphan, the widow, the lonely, the prisoner. The ones that he doesn't take care of, notice, only the rebellious dwell in a parched land. So he's not taking care of the rebellious, at least not here. We continue into verse 7. O God, when you went forth before your people. In other words, you led the procession when you marched through the wilderness. This is taking us back to Sinai. Now, I said we're not going to stay there, but right now we're still being reminded of that Sinai. And then we have a pause, Selah. Is that a musical notation, a musical climactic thing, a pause, maybe all of the above? Verse 8, the earth quaked. The heavens also dropped rain at the presence of God. And you say, well, did that actually happen at Sinai? We'll continue. Sinai itself quaked in the presence of God, the God of Israel. By the way, notice when it says the heavens also dropped rain. Now, the word rain isn't actually there, but the term when it talks about drop, it poured, and usually it's rain that pours. Although I can't help but think there was something else that poured from the heavens. Do you remember as they were in the wilderness, manna? They would wake up and it's like as if there had been an evening shower or dew on the ground, but it was edible. And so he took them in such a way through the Sinai, and he led them procession through the Sinai, taking care of them all throughout. So this is the wilderness experience. We continue. You shed abroad a plentiful rain. Now we're going to see Israel not in the wilderness necessarily, but now into the land. This is the rest of the story. You shed abroad a plentiful rain, O God. You confirmed your inheritance when it was parched. Notice, rain versus parched is by contrast. Your creatures settled in it. You provided your goodness for the poor, right? And we already talked about the poor, the downtrodden, the widows, orphans, and so on. He brought them into the land when they couldn't bring themselves. We continue, verse 11. The Lord gives the command. The woman who proclaimed the good tidings are a great host. Now we're seeing maybe something else that's happened in the land. Verse 12, here's what the women are proclaiming. Kings of the armies flee, they flee. She who remains at home will divide the spoil. Now, at this point, I'm asking, is there something of which this reminds you that took place in the land? This is reminiscent of something that took place, and we're going to see this nailed down very, very right now. You say, "Are you sure this is it?" I am sure, and we're going to see it in a bit. But let me give you a spoiler alert. This is reminiscent of the Deborah story, the Deborah narrative, where in a battle, women had a major part. Can I say it this way? From beginning to end, the whole battle started when Israel was being oppressed by a king from the northern part of the land, a pagan king, um, the king of Hatzor, Sisera, and the word of the Lord came to Deborah, a judge. Remember that, and Deborah went. Now Deborah didn't lead the armies, but she went to Barak and said, "God's telling you to lead the armies." And Barak says, "Well, okay, I'll go if you will." And Deborah said, "Just for that, it's going to be said that God gave the victory to a woman. It wasn't Deborah who was the woman. The rest of that story is another woman, a not Deborah woman." Um, but we'll get to that in just a second. Notice, kings of the army flee. They flee. And she who remains at home, this is not Deborah, this was someone else. And this was the woman Jael. And she was, somebody who was living in the land. She is in her tent. Her husband, I'm assuming, is away. And after the victory had been won by the Israelites, Sisera, the commander of the enemy, had gone running across and then been looking for a place of refuge. And he was really tired, and he came to her tent, and he said, "I need to lay down and catch some sleep." She said, "Well, sure, I'll bring you a cup of milk, and I'm gonna, sort of milk and cookies, and take it easy and go to sleep, and I'll watch over you." And she does watch over him. She goes and she gets a tent peg. And as he's asleep, she takes the peg and puts it over the temple of his head, over his head, and she nails him. I mean, she literally kills him with her own hands. So notice, she who remains at home will divide the spoil. That really did take place. We continue, still the story. When you lie down among the sheepfolds. Now, when you hear that line, you have to know that that's echoed in the Song of Deborah. The story of Deborah and Jael, you find that in Judges chapter 4, but then in chapter 5, you have the victory song, maybe a little bit of procession there too, that Deborah sings. She leads the congregation of Israel in song. And notice what she says. Why did you sit among the sheepfolds? That's where the line comes from. To hear the piping of the flocks among the divisions of Reuben, there were great searchings of the heart, and the song goes on. We're not going to look at the rest of that song, but I want you to hear that there's a line from the song, and that's enough to tie you into the Deborah story if you hadn't already picked it up. So when you lie down among the sheepfolds, you now it changes a little bit. You are all like the wings of a dove covered with silver, and its pinions with glittering gold. Now that's a little bit harder to pin down. Excuse my, I don't mean to do a play on words with opinions, but this picture of a dove that is, can I say it this way, that's glorified, that receives silver and gold. And think about the image of this little housewife, Jael, who's just sitting in a tent when the enemy of God shows up, and she is given the opportunity and the strength to complete the conquest. To, can I say it this way? Um, to bring to naught the enemy, the seed of the serpent. In fact, that term Sisera, the enemy king, just sounds a little bit like serpent-like. Sisera. You have to sort of hear the sound of that. Um, and this is being called to mind now in this psalm. We continue. When the Almighty scattered the kings there, it was snowing in Zalman. Now, Zalman's, that's to the south, so I'm not sure how that fits into it. Maybe it's imagery, maybe it's something else, but we go on to this mountain theme right now. By the way, maybe it was snowing that time of the year. I don't think we necessarily have to take it literally. Uh, but that mountain is referenced later on in the book of Judges, not in the Deborah story, but in a story that comes a bit later, in the story of Abimelech, another enemy of Israel. Even though he's the son of Gideon, he's actually another enemy of Israel. Um, Verse 15, a mountain of God is the mountain of Bashan. Now, this is not the same mountain as Zalmon. This is a different mountain. This is on the east side of the Jordan River. A mountain of many peaks is the mountain of Bashan. Oh, why do you look with envy, O mountains? And so, by the way, notice verse 15, I think is synonymous. So maybe, it's like, why are we talking about the mountain of God is the mountain of Bashan? A mountain of many peaks is the mountain of Bashan. It's talking about the same thing, whatever it's talking about. And then verse 16, why do you look with envy, O mountains with many peaks? Notice how that's repeated as well. At the mountain which God has desired for his abode, surely the Lord will dwell there forever. So the point is that God's going to dwell in his mountain. You look at these other mountains that are maybe a picture of his ultimate mountain, his ultimate victory. Right? That might be the call, the sort of similar thing that we have here. Verse 17, the chariots of God are myriads. Now remember, when you said chariots back in the ancient world, that was sort of the guided missile, the atomic bomb. It was the most advanced weaponry that anyone had in that day. So the chariots of God, not only does God have chariots in the way it's pictured here, are myriads, thousands upon thousands. This calls to mind that story of Elisha. I remember that in 2 Kings chapter 6, where an enemy king had surrounded the city where he was located, and his servant comes to him and said, man, we are in trouble. The whole city surrounded. And Elisha prayed. This isn't Elijah, this is Elisha. Prayed and said, O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So here's a picture of God's chariots at work. And then we see in rest of verse 17, the Lord is among them as at Sinai in holiness. So Here's that picture of God guiding them through the wilderness. He's the one who's brought them into the promised land, who gave victory to both Deborah and Jael in that story. We continue, verse 18. You have ascended on high. You have led captive your captives. Now, I'm going to pause on this because there's a lot to unpack. First of all, again, when you hear this line, you're supposed to say, "Wait, I remember this line. This is from earlier in the Bible. This again goes back to the Deborah story." So the term there, you've led captivity captive, shavitha shavi. Notice led captive your captives. The led part is part of the word. You've you've captured your captives, sort of idea. But it's not just capturing them, it signifies the leading in that procession, the victory procession. Here it is, Judges chapter 5, verse 12, and this is again from the Song of Deborah. Awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake, sing a song. She's doing that. Arise, Barak, and take away your captives, O son of Abinoam. Notice that phrase, take away your captives. It's exactly the same phrase, different tense. Instead, you have done it. It's a call to do that, but u shaveh shivika. So it's using a different form, different tense, but it's the same. It's the same term. Um, uh, leading captivity or captives. It has that same word twice. Um, Notice the arise, by the way. You've ascended, and now there's a call to ascend, a call to arise. It's the Lord who's done it, but Barak is acting as the hand of the Lord as he does this. Now, this passage is quoted in Ephesians chapter 4, beginning in verse 8. This is Paul speaking about what Jesus has done. And he cites this passage that we've just been reading. Therefore, it says, and now he's going to cite the Psalm 68, verse 18. When he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men, which is exactly what we're reading here. Um, Verse 9, now this expression, notice how he's not going to just quote it, but he's going to explain it. Verse 9, now this expression, he ascended, what does it mean except that he had also descended into the lower parts of the earth? Now, what is this descent into the lower parts of the earth? Some people get this wrong. I think it's real easy. Um, Notice that phrase "lower parts of the earth." That's actually another Old Testament phrase, not from the Psalm, but from Isaiah chapter 44 and verse 23. Shout for joy, O heavens, for the Lord has done it. Shout joyfully. Here it is, you lower parts of the earth. So there's the heavens, and there's the up there, the heavens, and there's the down here, you lower parts of the earth. That's what he's talking about. Break into a shout of joy, you mountains, O forest, every tree, everything down here in the lower parts of the earth, for the Lord has redeemed Jacob, and in Israel he shows forth his glory. We see this then in the next verse, verse 10, Ephesians 4:10. He who descended is himself he who also he who ascended. So notice the one who descended, that's Jesus coming to earth, not into like hell or anything like that, but just coming from heaven, from up there down to here. He who descended is himself he who also ascended, the same way that he came to earth by being born. After his death, burial, and resurrection, he ascended back into heaven bodily, far above all the heavens, so that he might fill all things. I think that's pretty clear. We continue because when Jesus did this by his descending and then ascending, the point is that he has led captive his captives. This is the cross. This is what Jesus accomplished in the same way that Deborah led or started the army, and then Jael finished the combat by putting to death the enemy with a blow to the head. There's a real way that Jesus did the same thing by his death, by the bruising of his heel, if I can borrow the expression from Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. He he pounded on the head of the enemy. He bruised the head of the seed of the serpent. He won against Satan. And so Paul takes this passage and he applies it to what Jesus did upon the cross. Now, we're not done yet even with that single verse. It continues, you have received gifts among men, and Paul's going to continue with that theme as well. Notice the gift part. And so he continues in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, the next verse. And he gave, there's the gift part, he gave some as apostles, and some as prophets, and some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers for the equipping of the saints, for the work of service to the building up of the body of Christ. That is, what Jesus did upon the cross didn't end there. That work continued, the effects of it continued into the giving of gifts, into the spreading of the gospel, into the growth of the church, the equipping of saints, the things that you do and the things that I do to build up the body of Christ. That's all part of the same victory procession. But notice we're still not finished with the verse. The last full line of verse 18. Even among the rebellious also, that the Lord God may dwell there. How does that fit in? To see this both in the days of the psalmist, back in the days of Deborah, but also by application to us. Who are the rebellious ones that God has come to grant and to give that God may dwell there? Who are the rebellious? That's the question. Well, again, we were the rebellious. Look in the mirror. We read in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, but God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And it doesn't end there. He continues that the Lord may dwell there. The book of Revelation, chapter 21, verse 3, where John says, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them. He died. He defeated us. He took us captive. We are the ones that have been captured, so that we who are rebellious would be brought under his command and that he would dwell among us. Notice the rest of the line, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. That is the victory of God. But we're not done with the psalm. So let's continue. Verse 19, blessed be the Lord, who daily bears our brethren. By the way, notice the term the Lord there is not all in caps, so that's not Yahweh, that's not the name of God, but that would be the term Adonai, which just means Lord. So blessed be the Lord who daily bears our burden, the God who is our salvation. Think about that, Selah, which everything we just described, God does bear our burden. He is our salvation. He came and died in our place to save us from our sins. Verse 20, God is to us a God of deliverances, and to God, notice this time, it is the term Yahweh. It is the name of God. So you say, well, why did they put God instead of Lord? Because the next term, and to God the Lord, the Adonai. So to Yahweh, the Adonai belongs, escapes from death. And it is we who've trusted in him. Can I say it this way? We who have been defeated by him. We who have been captured by him. Who have been led in captivity. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing to be captured by the Lord. And we escape from death. So that's our deliverance. We continue into verse 21. Surely God will shatter the head of his enemies. Does that remind you of somebody? Do you remember the Jael experience? Remember the way that is prefigured all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15? He will bruise you on the head. That it's part of this entire theme of the Bible. From beginning, have you seen this? From Genesis all the way to Revelation. God will shatter the head of his enemies. The hairy crown of him who goes on in his guilty deeds. And this is the enemy theme. Verse 22, the Lord said, I will bring them back from Bashan. I will bring them back. And notice how that's repeated, from the depths of the sea. It doesn't matter where to where the enemy runs. They're going to be brought back. They're going to be captured. At the end of the days, no one is going to escape the judgment of God. Either you find that Jesus was judged in your place and you find the cross as the judgment of God, or else, and here's the sobering thought, we will all stand before him. Uh, all will see that judgment at work. Verse 23, that your foot may shatter them in blood, the tongue of your dogs may have its portion from your enemies. Again, the enemy theme continues throughout these verses. Verse 24, they have seen your procession, O Lord. Now the procession comes to, notice in the next line, it comes to the sanctuary. The procession of my God, my King, into the sanctuary. So this is temple language. And so in this glory parade, in this victory parade, verse 25, the singers went on, the musicians after them, in the midst of the maidens beating tambourines. Everybody's involved, men, women, the singers, the musicians. Verse 26, bless the Lord in the congregations, even the Lord, you who are of the fountain of Israel. I can't help but think fountain of Israel. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but think about Israel being described as a stream that goes out and waters the nations. We have drunk from that stream. We're part of that fountain of, as Jesus calls it, that fountain of living water. There is Benjamin, the youngest. Now, you say the youngest? Well, yeah, Benjamin was actually both the youngest in age of all the brothers, but also the smallest. And yet Benjamin, notice, the youngest ruling them. Remember, the first king of Israel didn't come from Judah; it came from Benjamin. That was King Saul. The princes of Judah in their throng, the princes of Zebulun, the princes of Naphtali. We just have a representative sampling. We're not going to mention all the tribes, although these Zebulun and Naphtali, we're talking about the tribes that were there, especially in that conflict in which the Deborah narrative took place. Verse 28, your God has commanded your strength. Show yourself strong, O God, who have acted on our behalf. Because of your temple at Jerusalem, kings will bring gifts to you. Now, this brings up a question. When did kings bring gifts? And when did he bring them to either God or to the temple? And I can think of a few different instances. First of all, I can think of Hiram of Tyre, who helped to construct the temple, bringing gifts from Phoenicia, bringing the cedars of Lebanon, by which the temple was constructed. And then at a later date, I think of the Queen of Sheba, who came to Jerusalem to honor the Lord, to learn of the wisdom of Solomon, to bring gifts there. And then after the temple had been destroyed and was being rebuilt, there's this fascinating account of how um, uh, actually the order had gone out from one of the governors of Persia, stop that rebuilding, and the ramifications of that went all the way up to the emperor of the Persian Empire, Darius the Great, who said, "I want an investigation." And at the end of the investigation, Darius said, "You can go ahead and complete the rebuilding of the temple, and we're going to pay for it." So again, gifts that were brought to the temple, gifts brought to the Lord, but especially I think of the time where gifts were brought, not necessarily by kings, but by the Magi in Matthew chapter 2, as they came bringing gifts to the newborn king, the king of the universe, King Jesus. Finally, rebuke the beasts in the reeds. Now, that's a figure of speech. It refers to Egypt. We're going to see this in the context that Egypt's going to be mentioned by name, so that's not a wild guess. But remember how the Red Sea was described as the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, and that comes from the sort of the borderlines of Egypt. The herd of bulls with the calves of the people is picturing the beast. Now, this is not a nice depiction. Trampling underfoot the pieces of silver. He has scattered the peoples who delight in war, again, describing Egypt. Not a good picture. Now it's very clear in verse 31, envoys will come out of Egypt. But notice we don't stop there. Then Ethiopia will quickly stretch out her hands to God. So Egypt was described, in terms of beasts and trampling bulls and people delighting in war. That's not a good thing. But that last line, Ethiopia will quickly stretch out her hands to God. Ethiopia was the land just south of Egypt. If you Now, that's not modern day Ethiopia, but that's ancient Kush, what they called Ethiopia. And if you followed the Nile south, you went up the Nile, you would eventually come to Ethiopia. So it was sometimes connected with Egypt. Actually, for about 150 years, uh, kings of Ethiopia actually ruled Egypt in the 25th dynasty of Egypt. But that's a different story. Ethiopia will quickly stretch out her hands to God. Does that remind you of something? I think it does. Remember that as the early church was founded in Jerusalem, and then because of persecution began to spread out, one of the first places to which they came was the area just north of Jerusalem, just north of Judah, or Judea as they called it in days of the New Testament, and that was the Samaritans. And it was as the gospel was going to the Samaritans, the person who had brought the gospel there, one of the disciples by the name of Philip, not Philip the apostle, but Philip the deacon, was sent by God like to an out of the way place, still in the land, but down on the road to Gaza. And there he met with somebody from Ethiopia. Remember the Ethiopian eunuch, who is the first non-Jewish person in the book of Acts. Samaritans are sort of halfway Jews, so they don't count. But but the Ethiopian eunuch is the first non-Jewish person to come to Jesus, quickly stretching out his hands to God. Notice he's representing Ethiopia here. Actually, he was a official representative of Kandake, the queen of Ethiopia. Um, but I can't help but think about how there's echoes of this. Both we already saw Deborah, but also in the New Testament in the coming of Jesus. Now we have the praise: "Sing to God, O kingdoms of the earth," of which the Ethiopian eunuch was one of those. He was representing one of those kingdoms. Sing praises to the Lord, Selah, and chew on that. Think about that. This is where it's all been leading. To him who rides upon the highest heavens. Now, the King James Version captures it a little bit better. I think the idea is the highest heavens, but literally it's the heaven of heavens. So kudos to the King James on that very literal translation. But that's what it means, the highest heavens, which are from ancient times. Notice going all the way back to Deborah, going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Behold, he speaks forth with his voice, a mighty voice. So he speaks in verse 34. Ascribe strength to God. His majesty is over Israel, and his strength is in the skies. And we've been taken on a guided tour of Old and New Testament in the Psalm to see the strength of God, to see his majesty, to see his strength. O God, you are awesome from your sanctuary. And so we come finally, it's been referenced already, to the temple. The God of Israel himself gives strength and power to the people. Blessed be God. So in a sense, we started at Sinai, and the procession ends as we make it to the sanctuary. But remember, the sanctuary was only a picture. Jesus said, destroy this temple, this sanctuary, and in 3 days I'll raise it up, of his own body. But now he is building a new sanctuary, a new temple. And if you're a believer in him, you are part of that sanctuary. You are the sanctuary. And so he has brought strength and power to the peoples. Blessed be God.